Earlier this year, Canon Press published my book, How to Read a Book, Advice for Christian Readers. You can see the cover there on the screen. In this talk, I aim to highlight what I think is the most helpful, insightful part of the book, which is how to read at different levels. I feel like I'm using the podium for a hobbit. All right, so I'm going to get down like that. All right. So I was going to leave time for Q&A, but that wonderful choir, which was better than Q&A would have been, I think I'm going to just do a little bit of Q&A with Dr. Longshore at the end, if that's okay. All right. So I read at 3 different levels. I call it micro reading, macro reading, and surveying. But before I explain why and how, I don't want to quickly qualify my approach. So some people have good reasons not to read at different levels. So a case in point is John Piper, who's the chancellor at the school that I teach at. It's called Bethlehem College and Seminary. So John Piper reads at basically one speed. Slow, really slow. So here's what he says. I read painfully slowly. To this day, I cannot read faster than I can talk. Something short circuits in my ability to perceive accurately what's on the page. When I try to push beyond that, probably some form of dyslexia. So maybe some of you are like that. I won't ask for a raise of hands. But you may feel like all you can do is, if you're a bicycle, you're a one-speed bicycle when it comes to reading. But Piper, to encourage you, reads with remarkable skill. And I'm not suggesting that he would be better somehow if he read differently. God has used him in remarkable ways. So here's my qualification. The advice I'm going to give in this talk about reading at different levels is not for everyone. Maybe God has wired you to be more like John Piper in that sense. So my way of reading at different levels, which I'm going to make a case for, I'm going to explain, is not the only way to read. But I think it's the best way. I think it's a good way. So I'm going to share it with you, and you consider if it would benefit you. So how you read is related to how you are wired, to how God made you. And I'm wired more like my mentor, D.A. Carson, to read at different levels. So Dr. Carson trained me to read at different levels, and I've adapted a system that works well. I'm going to share it with you here. And it corresponds to some famous advice from philosopher Francis Bacon. So the numbers in brackets are mine. Some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, some few to be chewed and digested. That is, some books are to be read only in parts. Those are the ones that are to be tasted. Others to be read, but not curiously. And some few to be read wholly and with diligence and attention. Those 3 levels of reading correspond to what I'm calling survey, macro read, and micro read. So the survey is tasted, read only in parts. Macro read is swallowed, read but not curiously. And micro read is chewed and digested, read wholly and with diligence and attention. So here's how I would define these 3. For survey, quickly and efficiently size up a book without reading every word. For macro read every word, but move quickly to get the big picture. And then micro read, which is probably what you're most familiar with, is rigorously observe, understand, and evaluate what you read. So let me give you some analogies for these 3. If it's the analogy of travel, survey is like a helicopter. Macro read is like a bus ride. And micro read is like riding a bike or taking a walk or even excavating. Or to change the metaphor to cooking. Surveying is like using a microwave. Macro read is like an oven. And micro read is like a crock pot or a smoker. It might be more helpful to refer to these as not 3 levels of reading, but 3 layers of reading, with surveying being the base layer. They're cumulative layers. Surveying is foundational. And then macro reading builds on surveying, and micro reading builds on both of those. So as I explain each of these, I'm going to start with micro reading, because that's the kind of reading you're probably most familiar with. And then I'll explain macro reading, and I'll conclude with surveying, which you're probably least familiar with, and you might even be suspicious about. So we'll start with micro read. Micro reading rigorously observes, understands, and evaluates what you read. So the 3 levels of reading don't take the same amount of time. Surveying is fast. Macro reading takes much longer. Micro reading takes the longest by far. And it's the most active reading because you're rigorously tracing the argument. You're marking up the text. It's the most careful, diligent, detailed way to read. So to micro read well, you really should develop a system to mark up a book. So what I'm going to recommend here is for books you own. And my system varies a bit depending on whether I'm reading a print book or a PDF or a book in Logos Bible software. Here's what I do. I'll show you some screenshots. This is from a PDF I marked up of Steve Wellum's new systematic theology. So when I agree with a portion of a book, or I consider it an important part of an argument that I'm attempting to trace, I typically highlight it in yellow, or I underline it or place a check mark by it. And then I might write notes in the margin. This is a PDF, so you can see I put some notes here and added a note. So I'll write notes that affirm, reflect, reject, object, question. In this note here, I'm agreeing with Wellum and putting it in my own words. When I disagree, I typically highlight it in pink, or I cross it out, as I do on the screen here, or I place an X or a question mark by it. So this is a screenshot of my marked up PDF of a new book by Richard Hayes with his son Christopher. The book is called The Widening of God's Mercy, Sexuality Within the Biblical Story. And you can get a sense of what I think of the book by what I crossed out. So when an author includes a numbered list, I typically highlight the numbers or items in green, or I circle them or underline them. When an author includes a list but doesn't include numbers, I typically add the numbers, as I do here. So it's helping me track the argument. I number the headings sometimes as well. And then when a phrase or a line in a book strikes me as unusually punchy or brilliant, I typically highlight it in blue, or I underline it, or place a star or arrow by it. Or in this case, I place a box around it. This is a screenshot from John Feinberg's 800-page book on the doctrine of Scripture. So he has a chapter on illumination that's 52 pages, and it ends with this definition. It's a lot of work to get to that box. All right, so I don't typically take notes in a separate document. An exception is when I'm reading a book that I'm planning to review. So I find it most helpful to just diligently mark up the book I'm reading in such a way that I can flip through it later and spot what struck me as significant and why. Now, micro reading is typically what people think of as the most serious reading. All three levels of reading are active, but micro reading is the most active because you're rigorously tracing the argument. But even here, you can read at different speeds. You could read thoughtfully, but keep moving, like taking a bike toward Minneapolis. You're not rushed, but you're not unhurried. It's like this. If you're driving down the highway with your cruise control set to 60 miles an hour, and then, sometimes you have to tap on the brake because the traffic's getting slower, and you go down to like 5 miles an hour, and then you're back up to 60. It can be like that. Or another speed, you read unhurriedly and with deep thought, like taking a walking tour of Minneapolis. This is a sweet spot for studying the Bible. Now, when I'm studying the Bible, not when I'm just taking it in as an audiobook, but when I'm studying the Bible, I like to stop and ask questions like, why is this word here? Why is the word therefore here? Or how does this statement fit with this statement? Do they contradict? How do they fit? That's studying, and you can't do that quickly. So you're moseying along and taking your time. This is how I read Jonathan Edwards or John Owens. I have to take my time. And a third speed, even slower, is to read microscopically. This is like researching part of Minneapolis in depth by excavating it. So you put everything under the microscope that can fit there. You're turning over every rock. This is how you write a PhD dissertation. And that's why PhD dissertations are narrow. Now, I rarely read an entire book microscopically, but sometimes as I'm reading a book, I slow down and read a section of it microscopically if I sense it's significant for something I'm working on, or I find that part really interesting. So you can't properly feel, apply, express unless you first deeply observed and understood and evaluated. And micro reading is deep reading. So this is the kind of reading that the Puritan Thomas Brooks described nearly 400 years ago. Remember that 'tis not hasty reading, but serious meditation upon holy and heavenly truths that makes them prove sweet and profitable to the soul. 'Tis not the bees touching the flower that gathers honey, but her abiding for a time upon it that draws out the sweet. Therefore, it's not he that reads most, nor he that talks most, but he that meditates most, that will prove the choicest and strongest Christian. To help you meditate on what you read, I find the best practice is to evaluate it by writing out what you think about it. So Francis Bacon's advice above that I gave you about reading continues with this sentence. Reading makes a full man, conference or conversation a ready man, and writing an exact man. All three of those are important in your educational formation right now. And he says, therefore, if a man write little, he had need have a great memory. If he engage in conversation little, he had need have a present wit. And if he read little, he had need have much cunning to seem to know that he doth not. So reading, writing, and conversing go together to make you a well-rounded person. And when you read deeply, that copiousness overflows in conversations. Talking about what you read helps you clarify what you think about it, helps you communicate easily and promptly, and then writing about it, about what you read, forces you to state more precisely what you think about it. And there are many ways to do this. You can write about what you read privately, like in the front or the back pages of a print book or in a private document, or you can do it for a journal or a magazine or a website or social media. I even think it's helpful to post on Amazon.com under the book what you think about it. It's helpful for the author if it's a book that's worth recommending. It's helpful to prospective readers to encourage or discourage them from reading the book. And it's helpful to you by sharpening your evaluation and concise writing. So that's micro reading. Next is macro reading. Macro reading is faster than micro reading. You still read every word, but you move quickly to get the big picture. And you can do this by listening to an audiobook at a normal speed. It's possible to listen to audiobooks at a faster speed, but you have to train your brain to process words at a faster speed. I just was traveling across town in Doug Wilson's truck, and we got in, and his audiobook came up, and I think it was at 3.7. Yeah. So he can take it faster than I can. And since I just recommended audiobooks, I need to take a moment to defend audiobooks because I'm sure that in this crowd, there are some people I would call purists who don't think that audiobooks count as reading. That's nonsense. Listening to an audiobook is merely a different kind of reading in which someone else is reading aloud. I love audiobooks. I also love lists. And here are 11 benefits of audiobooks. Benefit 1, audiobooks are convenient when it would be difficult to read a print book. Think about this. It's hard. Don't read ahead. We're on number 1. Focus. It's hard to read a print book when you're doing manual labor, like chopping wood or washing dishes or digging a hole or folding laundry. It's hard to read a print book when you're lifting weights or doing cardio. It's hard to read a print book when you're driving a car or walking down a road or riding a bike or taking a shower. It's hard to read a print book when you're standing in a long line or traveling on public transportation and you're trying to be situationally aware. It's hard to read a print book when you're doing something that makes it difficult to hold a book in your hand, like holding a baby. It's hard to read a print book when you're in the dark. But in every one of those circumstances, you can read an audiobook. Amazing. That's just benefit 1. Benefit 2, audiobooks are convenient to store. They take up less physical space than print books. One problem in our home, as my wife and daughter over there can attest, is that we have run out of bookshelf space. Number 3, audiobooks are convenient to transport, more portable than print books. It's just not practical to carry a thick book with you everywhere you go. But if you have a phone, you can easily carry with you thousands of audiobooks. Number 4, audiobooks can be easier to understand and remember for some people. It depends on the learning style that is best for you. So engaging your sense of hearing is different than engaging your sense of sight. And some of us better understand and remember what we hear than what we see. So my wife, Jenny, over there, for example, can better focus on the book if she's listening to the words while she's doing something else, like folding laundry. She also reads print books, like on the plane yesterday, she was reading The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. But she typically gets more out of a talk or a book if she is listening to it while doing something else. Also, it can be challenging for those with dyslexia to read with their eyes. So one of my 4 daughters has struggled with this, and it's not because she lacks intelligence or good vision. People with dyslexia are perfectly capable of following a story and understanding concepts, and audiobooks are a gift for them. Benefit 5, audiobooks are an incredible deal. I'm not even selling you a particular book here, so I'm not getting anything out of this. What would it cost to hire a professional to read an audiobook aloud, live? What would that cost? How much money per hour? And what if the book is 20 hours long? An audiobook enables you to listen to a professional read aloud to you for a fraction of that cost, and to do it at any time you want, at a speed and volume that you can adjust. Amazing. Benefit 6, audiobooks can be delightful. My favorite reader is Jim Dale, who brilliantly performs the 7 Harry Potter books. He's incredibly gifted with different voices for the different characters. The UK version of that by Stephen Fry is not bad either, but Jim Dale's, he's the best. Second favorite reader is Andy Serkis, who masterfully performs The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He's also the one character the movie's got just right. And then some classics are available as dramatized audiobooks, sometimes abridged. My favorites are Focus on the Family Radio Theater and BBC Radio. Benefit 7, audiobooks give your eyes a break. I'm a research professor. I spend most of my time reading on screens and books in print, and sometimes my eyes need a break. And if I want to keep reading, I can do it with audiobooks. What a gift. Number 8, audiobooks can be a better option than reading with your eyes, especially for books you want to macro read. So it's almost impossible to micro read an audiobook. But you don't need to micro read every book. I prefer to read certain books with my ears, especially novels and biographies, history. I prefer to take that in with my ears rather than with my eyes. Number 9, audiobooks can helpfully supplement reading certain books with your eyes. Here's what I'm talking about. You can simultaneously look at a book while hearing it. And also, it can be a book that you've read before with your eyes, but you also want to listen to it. So every morning, I start the day by listening to the Bible. I'm a Bible professor and a pastor, so I'm studying the Bible constantly. But I love to let the Bible wash over me in large chunks where I'm not hitting pause and I just take it in. I'm going to miss stuff. I'm not going to be able to stop and track everything down. But there's a benefit that comes by taking in large swaths at a time as well. Number 10, audiobooks can enhance visual reading. It can benefit you to engage multiple senses, ears and eyes. One thing I'll do sometimes is I'll be looking at the Greek text of the New Testament while listening to an English translation. Or I guess you all could do that with Latin here, right? Every student can do that here. That's what I heard. Or sometimes people read books with their eyes and they don't learn how to pronounce words. And they get in high school and they say a word like Cherokee Indians, and it's actually Cherokee. Oh, I know. I've been reading that word for 10 years. No one told me. So an audiobook can teach you proper pronunciation. And finally, audiobooks are ideal for road trips. Listening to a good book by yourself is enjoyable. Listening to it with others increases your joy. All right. Those are 11 benefits of audiobooks. Back to the focus. That's macro reading. Finally is surveying. Surveying is quickly and efficiently sizing up a book without reading every word. It's learning as much as you can from a book in a short amount of time. Mortimer Adler, who wrote a book called How to Read a Book as well, he calls this inspectional reading and explains, its aim is to get the most out of a book within a given time, usually a relatively short time, and always, by definition, too short a time to get out of the book everything that can be gotten. Some people call this skimming. I don't like to call it skimming because the word skim doesn't connote good things when it comes to reading. It sounds like you're cheating or skipping or not really taking it all in. I like surveying, has better connotations. But many people, unfortunately, dismiss this concept of survey reading as if it's unworthy of the label. Some people think the only reading that counts is micro reading, slow and thorough. So survey reading is the most controversial type of reading. It's the type of reading people need the most coaching on. So let me make a case for why it's valuable, and then I'll explain how to do it. So I'll give you 5 reasons surveying is a valuable skill. First, it helps you quickly evaluate a book. So you can come to a book and ask, who's the author? What's the genre? What's it about? What's its thesis? Does the author seem competent? Does the book seem important? Is it interesting? So when I write my syllabi, I will have, for each class period, required reading in 3 columns. And I'll have the micro-read, macro-read, and survey. Under the survey column, I'll say survey for X number of minutes, at least X number of minutes. So it might be a 300-page book for 30 minutes, or a 500-page dissertation for 10 minutes, or whatever. Sometimes it's longer than that. But the idea is I'm not expecting the students to get everything they could possibly get in that amount of time. It's like taking a guy into a shop and saying, this is a chop saw. Here's how it works. Here's it, and you try. Here's a piece of wood. And get familiar with this tool. I'm not saying build a shed. I'm not saying frame my basement. I'm saying this is a tool. Here's what it's called. Get familiar with it. There are so many books like that I want to introduce my students to so that later in life, when they want to study a topic in more depth, they can go, oh, I was introduced to that tool, and I'd like to use it now. So it's just introducing them to tools. Surveying is great for that. A second benefit, it helps you determine whether you should purchase a book so that you have access to it later. You probably do this already with the look inside feature on Amazon, where you wonder, is this a book I should buy? Well, surveying, if you develop the skill, will help you know whether to buy a book. Number 3, it helps you pre-read a challenging book so that you're prepared to macro-read or micro-read it. So if you plunge into a demanding book without knowing anything about it, you'll likely get less out of it. Number 4, surveying helps you determine whether you should stop reading a book. So here's my attitude towards most new books, which might sound snooty to you. All right, there are zillions of books out there to read. I have a very limited amount of time. I'm going to die soon. Why should I give you any of my expiring life? I'll give you 60 seconds, go. And I'll look it over, and I have no problem with, nope, life's too short for you. There's just too many good books. C.S. Lewis says it's a very silly idea that in reading a book you must never skip. All sensible people skip freely when they come to a chapter which they find is going to be no use to them. Now, some of you feel a conscious bound duty to read every word of a book that you have begun. So this part of my talk is a gift to you. Calibrate your conscience and be free. You don't have to finish every book you start. Now, 3 exceptions to that. 1, it's a book that your professors are requiring you to read for class. Okay, that's different. Another one is that the book you're reading is the Bible. God breathed out the words, don't skip any of them, even the genealogies. And 3rd, you're reading a boring book that's crucial for your vocation. And a semi-exception is if you're reading a classic book that you have good reasons to believe will be rewarding if you persevere. It's not always true. I did that with Moby Dick recently, and I never got rewarded. And then reason number 5, surveying helps you determine whether you should macro read or micro read a book. So in this sense, it's pre-reading. Surveying a book helps you know what a book's about so that you can go back to it for deeper reading later on. So those are 5 reasons to do it. Now let me teach you shortly here how to do it. Surveying is impossible if the only way that you read is slow, deliberate, analytic, detailed, thorough. So here are some questions to ask as you survey a book, and I've clustered these questions around 7 issues. That's my last slide. Author. Who's the author? Have you read anything else by this author? Do you respect the author? Do you trust the author? How is the author qualified to write on this topic? Is he a clear and interesting writer? Second question is the author's reputation. Does he have a reputation as reasonable and wise? Have people you respect and trust assessed this author and book? How? And that can be a huge factor in knowing whether to read a book. If someone that you really trust highly recommends a book, that's why books have blurbs or endorsements. If it gets your attention when someone you respect and trust enthusiastically endorses a book. If it's a book on politics that David French and Russell Moore recently endorsed, that's helpful. It helps you know that that's a bad book. And then third is topic. What's the style of literature? How would you categorize the book? Is it systematic theology? Is it a commentary on a particular book? Is it a novel, science, history? Fourth is worldview. What does the author presuppose about reality? So James Sire distinguishes 9 major worldviews: Christian theism, deism, naturalism, nihilism, existentialism, Eastern pantheistic monism, New Age, so spirituality without religion, postmodernism, and Islamic theism. So when you're reading a book, what's the worldview of the author? 5 is argument. This was really important. So how would you summarize the argument of the book, of a nonfiction book, in a sentence? How does the author organize the book? What's the book's skeleton or structure? Now, is the argument faithful to what the Bible teaches? And you can figure this out by looking at the table of contents. Often the beginning and or end of the book will tell you this. I love it when books have not just a basic table of contents, but also a detailed analytic table of contents that's fuller, that helps you x-ray the book. 6 is audience. Who's the target audience? Is it thoughtful Christian lay people, moms with young children, politically conservative Christians? And then 7 is attractiveness. Does the writing draw you in? Is it cogent? Is it compelling? So flip through the book, dip into it, get a sense for how the author writes. And this rarely happens, but I love it when it does. I'm just processing books as they come through, and my attitude is this will probably get 60 seconds. And 5 minutes go by, 10 minutes go by. I've surveyed the book, and it just drew me in, and I'm already macro or micro reading it. That's a sign of a good book. Now, to end my talk, and before we transition to some Q&A with Dr. Longshore, I've asked him to bring some books I have not seen yet, and I'm going to quickly survey them and show you how this works in real life. What'd you bring? A Conflict of Visions. I've read this book. I'll pretend I haven't. It's by Thomas Sowell. So he's in his 90s. He's a black intellectual, probably an atheist, but just brilliant in his. He's like a social analysis, and what he's doing I've already read it, but basically, I'll sorry, man, I should have told you, pick a book I haven't read. What I would do if I were surveying it is go to the table of contents, and I see he's got part 1 patterns, part 2 applications, and okay, the back of the book is summarizing it. The gist is that there are 2 basic ways of looking at the world, and people tend to clump together in what seem to be disparate various issues, like take 20 different issues that seem disconnected, and they all clump together. Why is that? Read this book. Okay, what's this one? I have not read this one, probably because I'm not a well-read man. Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. I also know what this one's about, but I haven't read it. Kara, have you read this one? Yeah. Okay. So my daughter's read this one, and I've heard her talk about it. So it's harder, Dr. Longshore, you got me here. I think I said pick nonfiction, but I probably didn't say that. I thought that. Fiction is a lot harder to survey. So when you're surveying fiction, basically you're saying, who's the author? What's the story about? Is this a story that might interest me? So that's where I'd go there. And there's also, you can know who has recommended this. This would be a classic, meaning it's endured for a long time. There's a lot of conversation about it. That's easier to assess than a book that came out last year, where it's so new and there's just not a lot behind it to know, is this going to endure? So I already know this is a book worth reading because it's been around a long time. People keep talking about it. People keep reading it. I can't even read. Let's see. Christian Personal Ethics by Carl Henry. Okay, so I know it's a book about ethics, personal ethics, as opposed to like the ethics of a nation, probably. And Carl F.H. Henry, he's with the Lord now, but I know who he is. He was one of the movers and shakers of what's called New Evangelicalism. He helped form that in the 40s and 50s, and he was behind Christianity Today and Florida Theological Seminary, staunch defender of inerrancy and reading the Bible and acknowledging its inerrancy and authority. And in this book, which I have not read, he divides it into two major sections, 25 chapters, and okay, I need a little bit more time to analyze this one. But the gist is, it's an evangelical book on ethics. Is that Dr. Coppinger out there? I'm just looking up. Okay, I thought that was you. You're like a professional ethicist, right? So, yeah. Did you help write this book? Okay. All right. So there we go. And then, okay, Dr. Longshore. Yeah, the complete works of Michel de. I don't pronounce French very well. How do you say it? Okay, I'm going to skip that one. All right.